right. Just giving some time for us to get started today. Let people rock on up, and then we'll start today's webinar. Hope you're all looking forward to it. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you all had a nice week. And hope you're looking forward to today's webinar Wednesday. All right, I think I shall begin. As always, if people come in midway through stream, through the webinar, that's perfectly okay. You'll always be able to watch along the video on the same exact link right here. So, without further ado, let's get started with today's webinar, of which this week's topic is test data management, how we can get the right data for our testing. I'm your host for this webinar Wednesday. My name is Benjamin Taylor, and of course, this webinar is brought to you, and I work with Go Bigger, a IT testing company specializing in test automation right here in Germany. Although you can learn more about us at the end of today's webinar. For now, though, let's cover out what we're actually doing in today's webinar and what topics we're looking at. First up, I want to look at test data uses. Why do we need test data in the first place? What is test data? And we have to sort of solidify our definitions first before we actually get into today's real topic of getting the right test data. And how can we get our test data? Well, we have a couple different means. First up, we're going to look at gathering our own test data. So this normally means using services or means where we don't have to generate or make it ourselves, but instead we can obtain our data. But I also want to look at what happens if we create our own test data. Specifically, we look at either manually creating our test data, or we can even use AI to help us in this aspect. And finally, to end off this webinar, I also want to talk about some best practices we can also do to help us to make sure that the data we are using is the best possible. So, hope you're ready. Hope you're looking forward to today's webinar. And let's get into it with our first topic of test data uses. So, first up, what is test data in the first place? Because we're going to be talking about it a lot today, and it's used a lot too when we talk about software testing in general. So it's important to understand what it is. And what is test data? Well, think about when we're actually testing our systems. We often need some kind of data to go along with it. And so we can generally say that these testing inputs for our complicated systems are test data. Unless we're making very simple systems in which they just run and perform a specific function, then they're going to have inputs of some kind. And these inputs are test data. Although, as we'll explore a little further on, note that not all test data is necessarily a test input. Now, when we're looking and talking about testing data, it is important to know that depending on what kind of system we're working with, testing data can be really easy or really difficult to create. If we're working with a very simple system, for example, then it's normally pretty easy. Simple systems will have simple data. This makes sense. But if we're looking at more complicated systems, then this is where things can prove challenging. Complicated systems may have data requirements that have a lot of interconnections between the data, may have a lot of different data points. And so making this data ourselves can prove quite challenging, and it can be quite restrictive too. So of course, also, to expand upon what I meant by test inputs are test data, but test data aren't necessarily test inputs. I want us to clarify that the test data may include information that isn't being directly tested. we may have a bunch of information that isn't being actually tested in our different tests, but it still needs to exist. This can be for a variety of reasons. Perhaps we're training a neural network, and we need a bunch of training data that isn't necessarily test data, but it's still, it isn't necessarily test inputs, I should say, but it is still part of the training data, it's still part of the testing data that we can use. This also may be useful for load testing, for example, where we're not actually going to test on a lot of information in our test data, but it needs to be there for us to properly conduct load testing. When we also talk about data, we should also fully understand the data format and requirements of the data itself if we want to talk about valid testing. What do I mean by valid testing? I mean, we're talking about complete testing. We're talking the data is there, it is ready for us to use. Here's how we can manipulate it. Here's how we can transform our test inputs into our outputs, or some kind of output at least. So we need to understand what data, what format our data should be in. Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of errors. And an important thing about test data in general is that our test data should mimic the production environments as close as possible. The reason for this is because, of course, production is production. It is what our system is going to exist in, and it's going to use that kind of data in the first place. So if we're not using production-like data, then we're potentially going to miss some use cases, or, importantly, some edge cases too. Because there are a lot of restrictions. Because we can make a lot of restrictions in terms of test data, but if those restrictions don't pass into production, then there may be cases where that we're really missing. So that brings the important question of, well, how do we get production-like test data? And before we answer that, I want to first talk about the other possibility of, if we're not using production-like test data, then what happens to our data? What can happen to it? Well, a variety of different things can happen to it, because if we're not using production-like data, then it means we may be influenced by bias. We may only have a certain subset of how the application may perform. This isn't too important, I'd say, on some applications, especially if we're looking at machine learning applications of some kind, then we definitely want to reduce bias by any means possible. And this means if we only have a subsection of not production data, of data that we've crafted or gathered in some other ways, then any bias that may exist there is definitely going to influence our system and our tests. If our data isn't production-like, it could also lead to uncaught edge cases. There are simple facts that we think of when we think of user data. For example, we think that a name must have a first and last name. Not necessarily. We may think that a last name may need more than one character. Not necessarily. We may have certain restrictions on the types of characters are present in names. Definitely not. And whilst you might not initially think of these as issues, or as potential issues when you're designing edge cases, if you're not using production-like data in the first place, then you're probably not being able to catch these when they do appear. Next thing, and whilst the next point of what happens if our data isn't production-like, this may not influence the application directly, but if we are having bad data, we can see some side effects of improper handling of that data. What happens when the data is handled poorly? What happens when certain expectations aren't met? This does relate to edge cases, of course, but it may even be subtler and may result in just some anomalies being generated in the data itself. So we need to keep that in mind, that we always use good data and good quality. Maybe not complete, though. That is a key aspect of it. Another thing, if we're not using production-like data, then we're probably not using production-like quantities of data. Because if we're not using that, then we may find ourselves creating unscalable solutions. Yes, it may work for 20 entries in a database where you can look through and perform any SQL that you'd like for that, but does it work the same when we're looking at 20,000? What about 200,000? Of course, your application may never grow that big in the first place, and you'll need to understand and sort of rationalize what range of entries, if you're doing database, for example, you are expecting. So you have a sort of a reasonable range for your solution, for your project scape. But it's still important to understand how scalable is the solution we're making, because production data is normally going to get you a pretty good idea on how much it's actually going to be used and what you should be expecting. So first up, when we talk about our test data, let's talk about gathering test data, because creating it can be difficult, so let's try gathering it instead. And when we gather our test data, it can be pretty difficult. How we gather it can depend greatly upon the system that we're working with. Depending on the system, our data may follow some very simple and easy to use formats. And we can even use external resources to generate this test data itself. Perfect, that's a great way to sort of gather our test data, of just using these sort of off-the-shelf resources. Perfect. Or, as I've said, we can even use a portion of the production dataset itself. Maybe your application is already live and you're just testing in the backend for version updates or just proactive testing. Maybe. In which case, see if you can use some production dataset itself, part of the production dataset, to help ensure that you're testing correctly. Of course, I'm currently in Germany, in the EU, so I know there are a ton of data privacy laws and regulations. So maybe you can't use a production dataset for a variety of reasons. In that case, and in general, I would say you can also try asking business analysts. Business analysts will have a clear understanding of what the data you're working with is, and probably can help you in creating and gathering some of that data for your own testing purposes. Overall, when we gather our test data, I'd say some of the positives that we can look at are that gathering the data itself can be done quite quickly, especially if we're just importing parts of the production database or even anonymizing it a little bit. That can still be quite quick. And if we are choosing our sources correctly, then we'll mimic production really well. We'll talk about what happens if we don't use our sources correctly, though. And lastly, if we're gathering our data, we're normally gathering it from real life, which means our real life data will often have some edge cases that we should test with. So gathering our test data is a pretty fast and efficient method. At least in theory it is. But what about some potential negatives of gathering our test data? Well, a big potential negative is that finding the right data to gather can take some time. Perhaps we need to look at not only a specific subset, but a whole database. How do we gather specific bits of information that encapsulates a wide variety of use cases? Because if we don't look for those use cases, and if we choose our sources poorly, then we may be missing really crucial information needed for the system that we're actually testing. We may miss on a whole aspect or function of our system because, well, we just didn't grab the right data. And this means that our test data may be lacking in some areas and, importantly, some edge cases. We need to keep that in mind when we're gathering, that we can't always gather perfect data. And our data itself may just be missing aspects. So we really need to keep that in mind overall and know that, yes, test data, just gathering it from production or by other means can be great, but it can have these downsides too. And I'm not done yet, because there are more. And as I said, when we're talking about using production data sets in testing environments, this can break privacy regulations. So maybe a big no-no to take production datasets and just implement it straight into testing. Who has eyes on testing? Have they all signed privacy agreements? Is that even allowed from the end user's point of view? Don't know. That's something you have to keep in mind and keep an eye on. Probably ask your legal team about. We can also look at any inherent biases that may be present in the test data itself. If you're gathering from a biased source, then you're probably going to get some biased data. So you need to keep that in mind. And once again, this is especially useful and relevant when we're talking about neural networks and AI and the like. And if we're looking at our gathered test data, then another important aspect may be that our data is actually too perfect. But, Ben, you ask, what do you mean too perfect? Isn't perfect a good thing that we want? And yes, to an extent, we want good data, but we also want some imperfect data. Otherwise, we're lacking data for invalid testing. Maybe we want some specific examples of invalid test data. Maybe we're missing a field, maybe something is incomplete. This can be important, and this can be useful to test for. But if we're not gathering the test data correctly, then we may just be gathering too perfect of a data. So that's gathering our test data, but what about creating it ourselves? And why not try it and look at creating it manually, especially since gathering test data can prove difficult on occasion? Well, let's look at some positives of creating our own test data. In this case, we have full control over what data is actually made for our testing. And this lets us have great control over the edge and invalid data that we use while we're testing too. Okay, sounds pretty good. But what about some negatives with this? Well, if we are creating our own data, then it probably means that any large data sets that we want to make probably just aren't possible. Why? Well, unless you want to make all the data yourself in a large area, then you're probably not going to create those 20,000 database entries. You're only going to create the 20 or 30 that you need for your testing, and that's about it. If we're creating our data ourselves too, it also means that any data which deals with large amounts of dependencies between different databases or data sources, this means it's also going to prove quite tricky. So we're not really, it's maybe not impossible, but it is going to be quite difficult to accomplish. And I do just want to point out that testing with large databases itself may not just be a crucial aspect of your software. You know, if we're looking at proper testing, then we're looking at proper boundary value analysis and the like. So we don't need large data sets, yes, but we should still use large data sets if we're looking at things like load testing and other non-functional characteristics. In that case, then we need to think about large data sets when we're testing. We can separate these two, of course, but just something to keep in mind. Now, what about creating our own tests? Well, we can actually use some sites and services to create our fake test data for multiple services in whatever kind of format that we actually need. In particular, there are some faker software that can actually generate this information during the test cases themselves. Oftentimes as well, these standalone services can be formatted for easily importing them or being used in a data table of some kind. Using faker software to create the test data ourselves can actually be quite beneficial, as it means every test run will be slightly different, and it gives you a pretty clear indicator of if something breaks or fails, then you'll have a really good understanding of where it does so and why. So let's look at specifically creating it ourselves. Well, why would we want to create our own test data? This can be for a variety of reasons. One of which could be because we just want to examine specific edge cases ourselves, or look at specific kinds of inputs that we need. If we know exactly what edge cases or inputs we need, then create the data. We don't need to gather it and hope it's there. We can just implement it ourselves. And why do we do this? Because often we want to look at specific program paths or statements and observe some specific system behavior. We craft these cases with care because we want to test that what the system is actually doing to it is correct. And this means that manual creation of test data is actually pretty useful when we're talking about black box testing. Problem is, though, if we are creating all of our test data manually, then we often have no idea if this is, well, we don't have a guarantee if this is realistic kind of data that we should be expecting in production. Something to keep in mind there. As for some other details about manually creating our own test data, it could mean that manually creating our test data takes longer than just gathering it ourselves. We have to, as the name implies, manually create each and every test input and test data that we need for our testing. And if we're not planning appropriately, this may mean that we have a high chance of ignoring specific edge cases or over-evaluating some edge cases and missing others entirely. So you need to be well planned if you want to bring in and create manual cases yourself. And as I have said, in regards to large databases being difficult to test, means load testing becomes very difficult to perform, unless you just want to copy paste the test data that you've already made, in which case you're probably wasting a bit of time there. So what about using AI? Can AI help us to create some test data? Well, since AI is trained on a variety of areas, then it is already aware of some test software testing standards we can use in tests and test data. And if we can properly describe the scenarios that we're working with and what the test data needs to be, then AI itself can probably provide us some interesting values that may come from experience testing. It may identify specific examples of test data which have broken previous systems in the past and should be used now. Although the problem with AI, of course, similar to manual creation, that there's no guarantee of realistic data. Specifically, there's no guarantee of real data either, as the AI could possibly hallucinate some aspects. Say, for example, you're working with a GPS system that needs real addresses to actually work. Well, the AI will be pretty good and able to give you some real addresses, but it may on occasion still hallucinate a little bit and give you some address that's close enough but isn't quite real. Maybe that's an issue to your software, in which case the AI is responsible for it. So keep that in mind. But what about just asking AIs to create some test data for us? Well, yeah, it's possible, and we can do it. I asked an AI to create a very simple JSON output for some test data with a username, email, and address, and it was able to give me that quite quickly. And then I would specify that, hey, I want better test data. I want test data that is missing fields, has empty strings, has some invalid email formats, or malformed partial addresses, or unusual characters, or just long strings. I wanted the AI to create this test data for me that is good for looking at edge cases, and I was able to do so quite quickly and I'd say quite efficiently. This is a very simple example of what AI can do for us in software testing, but it's still useful to know and and can be quite beneficial to use overall. So, can AI help us create test data? Well, definitely. It can be really useful to generate some test data quite quickly, and it may generate some really useful edge cases too. Maybe edge cases that we haven't thought about at first glance. Although, of course, remember that the AI isn't always perfect, and in our responses to our queries, it may give us some improper data structures, in which case we'll have to manually fix that ourselves. So just make sure that whatever you get from the AI, you do put through a sort of check system of some kind to make sure that it is formatted as you expect. And that brings us to sort of the end of today's webinar, where we look at our best practices. So what can we do to get the best data from different methods we've looked at today, which I'd say, well, let's stick with a simple solution, and let's actually just combine these methods. No one method is perfect, but if we take the best parts of each of these, then we're going to get something really great for our testing data. So let's gather the data where possible, especially if we're looking at volume and we want to simulate some levels of production environments. Then let's look at manually creating our data for edge cases. For edge cases or some really rare scenarios where we don't believe we've actually gathered this in production. And then, once we have a pretty good understanding of our production-like data from gathering it ourselves and from edge cases from creating it ourselves, let's use AI to assist and fill in any blanks that it may think are beneficial. Maybe the AI won't pick up anything new, or maybe it will give us a brand new idea. Who's to say? Who's to tell? But it's beneficial all the same. And if we can use AI for our projects, then it's probably a pretty good idea just to have it in there at least a little bit. But how do we manage our test data? That's a big question, because we could just chuck it in a file, we could just make it part of the testing suites themselves, but that creates redundancies and that creates issues if the software changes. So let's actually look at some test data management tools, or TDMs. TDMs are a proper way that we can hold on to our test data separate from our test suites and separate from the application itself. TDM tools allow us to manage versioning of our test data. So if we need to update our test data in some format, or let's just say our application changes and requires more data, then we can include a new version of that test data into our test data management tool. We can also use test data management tools, oftentimes with test runners, in order to pull test data from the TDM that the runner can use automatically. We talked about this earlier when we were talking about Baker software, and that can generate on the fly. But test data management tools often have integrations with a lot of test runners, so we can do this here as well. So each run will be slightly unique, slightly different. Or we can just get the exact test data that we want from our TDM during the test runner itself. TDMs, of course, since they're not just isolated and located in one location, mean that we can enable collaboration of the test data that we're using. So now you're not the only one writing all the test data. You can actually work with your team and find the right amount of data that works for everyone. Plus, TDMs also normally come with data extraction and anonymization tools. So if we are allowed to take some data from production, we can use TDMs to help extract this data and further anonymize it so even if a tester sees the raw data, it doesn't mean anything to them, and identities are safe and secure from the production side. In terms of software itself that we can use for test data management, there are quite a few popular examples, of which some that I found and have not used myself, but I've heard of, include Delphex or Informatica, IMB Optum, K2View, or Solix. Basically, there's a lot of different tools. So, first of all, use the tool that your project is already using. And then second of all, if your project isn't already using a test data management tool, why not go ahead and suggest one? If you're familiar with one specifically, or you're already using one made by the same, already using another tool made by the same company, then go with that. But otherwise, have a look around, see what fits your exact needs. And that brings us to the end of today's Webinar Wednesday. As always, if there are questions, feel free to place them in the chat and I'll be more than happy to answer them as best I can. But whilst the questions come in, let's talk about us at Go Bigger. So, first of all, if you enjoyed the webinar and you are not already following us on LinkedIn, which is probably how you found this webinar in the first place, why not go ahead and give us a follow? It really means a lot to us, really helps us out, and you can keep up to date with our upcoming webinars and check all our previous webinars too. Plus, if you want to keep up to date with us and learn about what current available courses and workshops we have, you can go on over to our website, gobigger.de/shop, to find our available courses. Currently, we have one for the Robot Framework Certified Professional certification, plus a general Robot Framework course as well. But we have more on the way, so do keep up to date. And speaking of keeping up to date, if you want to keep up to date with us, why not go ahead and sign up for our newsletter of Grow Bigger. This is a monthly newsletter that we use to keep you up to date with everything Go Bigger, from our courses that we have available and are developing, to our previous month's webinars in case you missed them, to what's happening next month in webinars, plus what's happening in software testing and software testing events in general. It's super easy to subscribe, it's just one click, and you type in your email, and if you ever want to unsubscribe, that's also simple too. So you have nothing to lose by signing up and keeping up to date with Grow Bigger. That covers it for today's Webinar Wednesday. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you've learned a little bit too about how you can get the right test data for whatever your needs are. My name is Benjamin Taylor. This has been a Webinar Wednesday from Go Bigger. I hope you've enjoyed, and looking forward to seeing you next Wednesday to look at the evolution of a QA tester. Looking forward to seeing you there. Have a great week. See you all soon. Bye.